Of course.
Our next presenter is Dr. Gottlieb. Dr. Risha Gottlieb is a licensed clinical psychologist and the clinical director of New Perspective Psychological Services, one of the co-hosts for this morning for today's event. She received her doctoral degree from St. John's University, where her research fellowship focused on substance use and gender presentation in lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. She served as the Director of Behavioral Health at Choices Women's Medical Center, where she helped to establish a department focused on providing behavioral health care as part of a holistic approach to women's health within a reproductive care center. She founded New Perspective Psychological Services, a group practice with a mission to provide evidence-based, culturally competent services to diverse communities and for clinicians who are adept at exploring racial, gender, and sexual identities and experiences of discrimination from cognitive and dialectical behavioral framework. Community members, I'd like to welcome Dr. Risha Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb.
Hi. Well, I'm here today as Dr. Gottlieb, but I'm also here today as Risha. I'm here today as somebody who is Haitian and Jewish, somebody who is queer and a parent, somebody who's deeply, deeply angry and sometimes feels quite helpless in the face of what is happening to Black and brown bodies. So I'm going to be talking to you today about a topic that I'm very familiar with: how to cope with guilt when there's always something more to be done, otherwise known as taking care of yourself when the world is on fire and there isn't a damn thing you can do to put it out. And to talk about this today, the first thing that we are going to do is something that sounds ridiculous. We're going to define what coping and guilt actually are. We're going to move into what healthy engagement in resistance is or could look like, and how to get out of some of the traps that guilt sets for us. First thing to know is that coping is not now and never will be a bubble bath. Coping and self-care have become diluted by capitalism and platitudes so that they have become synonymous with spend money on yourself, you deserve it, and just be nice to yourself. That is not what coping is. The word to cope, the root of that word, comes from the a root in Latin that means to cover, as in armor. If you are coping, you are mitigating what is assailing you. You are wearing armor. You are not having a good time. You're not relaxing. It doesn't feel great. Coping requires something of you. Coping requires consideration, thoughtfulness. And as part of that consideration, if you are a Black or a brown person, if you are a queer person, you have to consider how to decolonize your sense of self. And why that's so important is that we are told who we should be, what beauty is, and those images are not of ourselves. I can't say it better than Audre Lorde could, and so I'm going to invoke her again. If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. If you are coping, you are unfurling so that you can't be eaten by it alive. The next thing to talk about is guilt. And I think about any negative emotion, anything that feels bad isn't necessarily bad. Redemptive guilt lets you know that you've acted in a way that violates your own values. It focuses on what you can do to not cause pain to others ever again. If you feel guilty, and this is for people listening now, and I know that we do have white participants as well. If you feel guilty about white privilege, that's a good thing. Don't do anything about it. Don't ask anybody else to do anything about it. Just feel guilty. You're supposed to. And that is all I'm going to say about redemptive guilt for the rest of this presentation. The rest of the time, we're going to be talking about non-redemptive guilt. Non-redemptive guilt comes from a place comes from a foundation of unrealistic expectations that you place on yourself, society places on you, or maybe even the people who love you place on you, you can never meet those expectations. It fuels shame. I have not done enough because I am not enough. And it gets you to engage in self-flagellation, otherwise known as paralytic rumination. You think that you're atoning by thinking over and over and over again about what you've done wrong, but you're actually just stuck and fueling further sense of guilt and regret. Now, in coming up with this presentation, in really engaging in what it means to resist, and I'm going to define resistance broadly here. Resistance is coming to this presentation. Resistance is voting. Resistance is wearing a t-shirt that shows your own political views in a place where you're not sure how it's going to be received, otherwise known as the grocery store. So when we engage in resistance, we move through 3 different states of mind. And this is adapted from DBT. I'm a DBT and CBT practitioner. And we all engage in these states of mind at one time or another, but only dialectical engagement is something that is sustainable in the long term. That's what we're always striving towards, even if we're not always there. So when you're engaging in naive resistance, that is the part of you, of all of us, that says, we can work together to eliminate racism. And that's a beautiful thing. It is hopeful, it is energetic, it is purposeful. It also produces a deep sense of personal failure and guilt, as you will inevitably fail. Which reminds me of jaded engagement. That's where my mind has been much of this time. This country is always going to have racism. It always will have racism. It's been built on racism. F it. The pros, it acknowledges history. It acknowledges a desire, I think, that all people have for an in-group or an out-group, and us versus them. But it also really fosters a deep, deep sense of hopelessness and helplessness and resentment and disconnection that isn't a place that you want to live or bathe in. So dialectical engagement. A dialectic is something that holds 2 concepts that sound like they should cancel each other out as equally true at the same time. And in holding both of those truths, you create something that is larger than either of them separately. Racism will never be eliminated, and my resistance is meaningful. If I can get to a place where on most days, I and you can accept that as true, well, then you can let go of guilt and shame because you no longer have unrealistic expectations while holding on to hope. If you can radically accept that you will never be able to do enough, maybe you can accept that you can be enough. I want to share with you a dialectical statement that is meaningful to me. I am fighting the same fight that my ancestors fought. And the road that I walk while I do so is not the same path that they walked before me, even if it passes through the same trees, the same crags, the same cliffs. It is a disservice to my grandparents, my ancestors, to every great-grand other that I will never meet or know about, to say that their fight didn't lay down gravel on the path that I am currently walking. Which brings me to a trap. Guilt, non-redemptive guilt, traps you. And here's guilt trap number 1. I'm not currently in the streets, so I'm not an activist. I'm not engaged. I'm not in the resistance. Who's thought that? Guilt trap number 2. I should have called out or educated Karen. That regret that sits with you. Guilt trap number 3. I have not given every inch of myself to the movement, so I'm not in it. Guilt trap number 4. I'm lazy because I've gotten nothing done all day. Guys, can I tell you about the Netflix I have been watching? It has been glorious, mindless sci-fi. And you know what? Sometimes I look at the clock and it's 5 hours later and I don't even know how that happened. So coping statements. This is what I tell myself when all those traps are around my ankle, weighing down on my back. Living my life is enough. I do not owe anyone an explanation, education. They are not currently paying me for my wisdom. So if I give it, I choose to give it. And if not, me living my life is the education that they should be paying attention to. Self-compassion is not self-indulgent. There is a difference. I do not have to align with my everyday life with struggle on the inside to align my life with struggle on the outside. I can align myself with grace and with ease. And let me tell you, when I think about grace, I think about unearned latitude that we all have. We didn't do anything to deserve it, and nobody can take it from you. We don't need or want, and this is mine. This is the one that really sits with me, and I tell myself over and over and over again. We don't need or want another martyr who died young. We carry stress in our bodies. So if I carry guilt, I will die young. I will age into my wisdom. I will guard my energy so that I can teach the next generation how to live with conviction, grace, and playfulness. And the last thing I want to talk about is how to conquer paralytic guilt. Again, you're going to see me fall back on my background as a DBT therapist and talk to you about how to get to your wise mind to get through this. You know what? If you genuinely feel guilty that you should be doing more, do more, but use your wise mind to figure out what that means for you. Okay. You're going to notice a diagram that looks very familiar. I've been told by a lot of my clients that I like circles. That's the best way that I present information, and they're right. So emotion mind is that part of all of us that is mood dependent, reactive, and impulsive, whereas logic mind, and don't be seduced by the word logic here. Logic sounds good, but it's a trap. Rational, deliberate, and pragmatic, that is the part of you that reads 30 reviews before buying a set of curtains. And you don't even know how like 15 hours went into that kind of research. So your wise mind lives in between those two. Your wise mind necessarily includes your emotions and facts. It is values driven, it is personality driven, it is driven by your history, it acknowledges your personal wisdom and the wisdom of others. Okay, well, that's very nice, but how do you get there? So here are some questions that you can ask yourself right now to help you reach your wise mind. When I'm thinking about my emotions, will I carry resentment towards myself or others if I do or do not follow through the action I am considering? Is the action that I'm considering something that I've been thinking about for a while and mulling over? Or is it the kind of thing that pops up into my head and feels so pressing? Then I take my logic brain. What is the likelihood that my actions will result in serious harm for myself or for the people in my household? Health, loss of income, loss of a caregiver? And only you answering those questions together can I come up with my wise mind. And you'll notice that that's blank, because everybody's wise mind will tell them something different. Now, my emotion mind has been telling me to be in the streets, but my logic mind knows that I'm a parent of an infant whose health is the most important thing in my life. So in the context of COVID-19, I just can't be there. And my wise mind brought me here today. While non-redemptive guilt is brittle, your wise mind is flexible. Use flexible thinking in a number of different ways to resolve these problems. I can't, whatever, because whatever. I can't be in the street and protest because I have an infant and parenting that infant is my first priority. All right, so if I'm going to think flexibly, here's what I do. Can I remove the thing that's blocking me from getting in the streets? I can't. I'm a parent now and I always will be. Can I reprioritize things so the consequences are acceptable if they do occur? Not in this situation. Risking my son's health isn't worth it. Flexible thinking, can I do something else? Yes. Yes, I can. Here's where I can resolve this for myself. And I can't do something else without making that something else worthy, without making this worthwhile. So this has been worthwhile for me, and I hope that what I had to say has been worthwhile for you. I hope that you use what we've said today to nourish yourself and to take care of yourself. In thinking about the ways in which I personally have been coping, I must say that putting together my thoughts as well as my presentation has been a coping skill of mine. But you know what? So has trying to leave the house every day, not being mad at myself when I don't have time to exercise, reading books by Black authors that are not about racism and slavery. So I don't know if those skills will help you, but they certainly help me. Thank you so much for being a part of this. The next slides are not slides I'm going to read, but after this you will see some resources that you can use for yourself. Antoine?
Yes, thank you very much again, Dr. Gottlieb. So we have at least a question from Kevin, who has asked, do you have any recommendations for individuals who are interested in entering into therapy, psychological, mental health world as a licensed clinician and interested in being a dissent voice in clinical spaces to better represent my communities, but also help to, as you said, decolonize the practice? And he just commented that Dr. Cabral mentioned that the psychoanalytical paradigms are overwhelmingly white. Mm-hmm. Just curious if you have any pieces of advice you would give given yourself when you enter the space, but really for me, because time doesn't work like that. So maybe any of you can jump in and answer the second part, but I think the first part is for you, Dr. Gottlieb.
Sure. Well, first thing is do it. Become a clinician and put yourself in a space in which you can serve your community. Also, be guarded that some of those spaces may try to take advantage of you. And if you find that, find a different space. That goes back to some places do kind of sell you the idea that if you haven't given all of yourself to the movement, then you haven't been a good enough therapist, and that is false. So the second thing that you're asking about is how to decolonize your practice. And if you're asking for a specific paradigm, the truth is right now there isn't a specific paradigm that I can share with you. But what I do is I really think critically about the paradigms that I practice under and highlight for myself, for my clients, and hopefully for you, some of the ways in which they need to be tweaked. Cynthia brought up the idea that they're predicated on abuse stopping. Racism is the ultimate abuse and it will not stop. It is the ultimate invalidation, like Thomas said, and it will not stop. So I can't base my practice on the idea that you will be safe from racism and I should help you check the facts on that. Instead of checking the facts, what I should be doing is validate and ask you, what is your life worth living given the options you have before you? And instilling the idea that you can have a life worth living in the face of racism.
Yeah, I think Risha responded to that so beautifully. And I don't have that much to add, except to say that if you are a therapist of color who thinks critically about how to apply, the behavioral interventions and the analytic techniques that we are taught, and you do so in a critical way while working with clients of color, you are decolonizing the practice. Congratulations. That's all that's needed, right? Like, you know, what that means for me is that I will frequently go off script and I will say, look, this is what we have to work with. This is how this may or may not apply to you. And just that open acknowledgement of like, we might need to like work extra hard together to find something that works, because right now I don't have that many tools for you and I'm so sorry. So yeah, that is what I would say there.
I definitely agree with everything that Risha and Cynthia said, beautifully stated. The only thing I would add is just to make sure you kind of create spaces, you know, especially as a clinician of color, where you're connecting with other clinicians of color, other people involved in the mental health field. There's so many people, you know, along the way that like helped me with the journey. From one of my mentors, Auntie Pat, who really, you know, encouraged me, you know, to enter, you know, into a graduate program. To the unofficial Black Girls Club that we formed at our graduate program, and to people that I've met, you know, after, you know, graduating, like Risha, and, you know, then people, you know, then meeting through this forum. So I definitely think to kind of create a space where you're connecting with other clinicians of color or people who are doing similar work, even if they're not a clinician.
Thank you. Kitama, do you want to add to this? You have to unmute.
Thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. I think the most important piece is to identify your values before going into it. So, because every therapist has different reasons for going into it, as I'm sure anyone who's been in therapy or met a therapist has realized. And it's so important to work places that align with your values, or where you settle down to align with your values. I think every clinician of color has worked places that did not fully align with their values, even if what they were personally doing did.
And even if they told you that they did.
Oh yeah, they all tell you they do. So it's so important to find that place that is going to provide, for my values, high quality therapy that is accessible and is affordable. Because for anyone who has gone to a community clinic, it is challenging to find a therapist who has the support that they need, the training they need, and a caseload size where they can actually be there for you as a patient. Because they're not going to do it if you have 200 patients. We just can't. So figure out what your values are, how you can reach that community, and make sure everything you do sticks to those values.